I'm getting feedback. We're fairly low on numbers, but that's hardly a surprise with blistering sunshine outside and people knowing that they can always look at our webinars at some point in the future when they're actually posted up on our YouTube channel. So, there might be people playing it canny, and I think we might have lost one because I just said that, so I'll be quiet. Okay. I am going to start sharing my screen if that's okay. Oh, no, I'm not. Let's get the order correct. I am actually going to hand over to Eleanor, who's going to tell us a little bit about the Kerry Biosphere. So Eleanor, can I hand over to you? Is that okay?
Yeah, thanks, Dean.
Thank you.
A whistle-stop tour of the Kerry Biosphere. So just for anyone who hasn't visited yet, I'm sure you're all planning to do sometime in the future. The Kerry Biosphere Reserve is actually a landlocked mountain biosphere reserve in Kerry, which is in southwest Ireland. We are home to the Gillicuddy Reeks, which is the highest mountain range in Ireland. I think we have 10 of the highest mountain peaks in Ireland, which is quite significant. And we also are home to Clarny National Park, which is one of the oldest national parks in Ireland, where we have one of the last native herds of red deer, and there's also some of the significant stands of native oak and yew trees as well. So it's a really, really beautiful spot. And I just learned this morning that it is home, the only known breeding area for one of the dragonflies in Ireland as well. I think the emerald dragonfly. So yeah, a really, really amazing spot to live and to work. So hopefully you'll get to see and visit soon. In our next webinar, actually, we'll be focusing on plants in the Kerry Biosphere. So join us again then if you're into plants, and you'll learn a little bit about the differences between the ones in Dublin and in Kerry, which is two very different ecological areas. Thanks, Dean.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much, Eleanor. That's really interesting. I look forward to the next webinar there about plants. And I know you've some really unusual species. There was a fern, wasn't there, recently discovered?
Yeah. The only known site of it in Ireland, I think, actually. It's quite rare for Europe. So.
And the thinking was that it was transported in the high atmosphere from the tropics, and just found this nice piece of wet bog or something, or land.
Beautiful.
Forest,
who could come to Clarny and not decide to want to stay and live there? Who even the plants are doing it now.
Great stuff. So now, Richard, we're going to hand over to you to maybe share a little bit of information about the Isle of Man Biosphere.
Thank you, Dean. Yep, Biosphere Isle of Man was designated in 2016. So we're just a few years in, a relatively new member partnership. Diverse habitats on this island, really. We've got the purple moors up to about 2,000 feet high. We've got some beautiful Gallic heath where the golden western gorse mixes in with the bell heather and the ling. On the coast, we've got grasslands in the springtime. We've got lovely blue spring squirrel comes through, and on the rocks, lots of the pink thrift. And there's a few unusual additions that seem to have gained Manx connotations, like the Manx fuchsia and the Manx palms, which come from a very long way away, Chile and New Zealand, I believe. As an island, obviously, we've got far fewer plants than the larger landmasses in the British Isles due to the small area here and the isolation that we've got. But as I say, it is quite diverse in many ways. Up on the Ayres National Nature Reserve, there's a few examples of some of the flowers that we see. We've got field gentians, Portland spurge, some of these rarities, moonwort, adder's tongue, lovely little fern. And Isle of Man cabbage, which is not restricted to the Isle of Man, but is found elsewhere around the Irish Sea. We've also got least willow, which is hanging on in our toppermost tiny little patch on the summit of Snay Fell. So with the global warming, that's quite a worry. So that's our smallest tree at about 1 inch high. So it takes a bit of searching out because it looks pretty similar to the biltong at the same level on the same hill. But yeah, when you get your eyes down, right down at ground level and crawl about, you can spot that right up on the summit. And then much lower down, we've got Wilson's filmy fern, which you can find tucked away in the humidity of one of our waterfalls. Very delicate plant that survives where it's nice damp air down there. People who come over love to see in June time, the Manx Wildlife Trust does orchid walks at this field just behind me, called Close Start Field, the Wildlife Trust Reserve that has quite a range of orchids and all sorts of other plants as well in the Ballath Curragh. And they produced a fantastic meadow out of what was farmland 20, 30 years ago. Other things going on are we're developing in the Biosphere a nature recovery network. We're hoping to have a website and people can add in areas that they're providing habitat for nature. We've got a particular project which might be of interest to some people called Wildflowers of Man that's been running for 20 years now, which was set up to propagate native wildflowers and use them in appropriate local projects. Currently, they're very busy with the Ramsey Forest project as their main project just now, which is joining together fragments of ancient woodland around the edge of Ramsey and producing community woodland resources, facilities as well. So it's quite a cohesive project. But they also do rare species action plans on the conservation side and work with the college students and volunteers spreading knowledge and engaging with the community. And mentioning there, Eleanor, your fern, I'm wondering what that one is now. It takes me back to about 25 years ago here, or maybe a little longer. There was dense flowered orchid found on the Ayers National Nature Reserve, and it's not been seen for many, many years. And the thinking is that it probably blew in from Ireland somewhere and settled and flowered for a few years, and but didn't quite establish. So yes, we probably do gain a few species from your side of the water on occasion. Thank you, Dean.
Very interesting. Thanks very much. I was really interested to learn about the Nature Recovery Network. I'm really into community engagement. That sounds like a wonderful project. So I'll definitely be looking that up. And that's the brilliant thing about, you know, Biospheres working together as we get to share ideas. And we certainly have taken a couple of ideas from the Isle of Man in the past. So it's great having having that network. So I'm just going to share my screen. I've got a short presentation that I'm going to give. Now, I'm still logged in. Very good. So I just want to go full screen. Can everyone see that?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, good. Okay. So we've had our introductions, which are fantastic. We're going to have a series of presentations, first by Dr. Melinda Lyons, then Dr. Nolene Smith, and finally Dr. Tim Rye. And then we're going to have a session at the end, 20 minutes at the end, where we're going to take your questions and answer your question, have our experts answer your questions. And we aim to finish on the dot at 3:30 so everyone else can get out and enjoy the sunshine. So moving on. So a little bit about Dublin Bay. So this is a great image of our biosphere. It encompasses pretty much the majority of our biosphere. You've got the River Liffey flowing down through our capital city, Dublin, and out into Dublin Bay. We have a population of 330,000 people who live within our biosphere, which is unusual. And it's actually unusual for a capital city to feature in a biosphere. So we're very fortunate. We're very fortunate to have so many fantastic nature reserves within a capital city. You know, these are places for people to enjoy, but obviously that brings about certain pressures. So on this image, on the top left-hand side, there you have Howth Head. To the foreground, you've got North Bull Island. I believe they're going to be featured in one of the talks. On the right-hand side, you've got Dunleary Harbour there, and beyond that, Dorky Island and Killiney. So just some images from our biosphere. You have top left Collymore Harbour looking out to Dorky Island. You've Howth Harbour, you've Dunleary and the bandstand, and you've got North Bull Island, which was the home of the original biosphere, which was established in 1981, and then expanded to include the whole of Dublin Bay in 2015. So what is a biosphere? So biospheres are internationally recognized for their biological diversity. That's the important thing. So we have really important, internationally important species living within the biosphere, within our capital city. It's a United Nations designation. There are 714 biospheres around the world, and the program was launched in 1971. So as I mentioned previously, this is the 50th anniversary, and this is the reason why we're holding these tri-biosphere webinars, to actually share the wonder and beauty of our biospheres. So biospheres have three primary goals. The first obviously is conservation, so to protect those important species that we have. But it's also there to support a sustainable economy and society. So we want businesses to enjoy our biosphere, but in a way that's not going to impact on our biosphere. And we support them and promote them through a Biosphere business program. And then there's learning and support, and we've three experts here who are engaged in that learning element to understand what's happening in our biosphere, the process that are happening in the biosphere, so that we can learn from that knowledge, and that informs our development planning decisions. But it also helps us to share that knowledge with the general public, and again, this is part of that with these biospheres. So our Biosphere vision is to celebrate and promote a wider appreciation of the natural and cultural heritage of Dublin Bay, to capture the inherent passion of the community for the biosphere concept, and for the Dublin Bay Biosphere to be an exemplar for a new wave of biospheres in the World Network. And we certainly hope that there are going to be more biospheres in Ireland. We have 2 in Ireland at the moment, ourselves and Kerry Biosphere, but we hope in the not too distant future there will be others joining us. And the second part of our vision is for Dublin Bay Biosphere will be recognised and valued as a place where people, nature and culture connect. So it's important that we engage with these places, learn to appreciate these places, and in doing so, help protect these places. And where residents, visitors and businesses directly contribute to the conservation of their natural, cultural and built heritage through everyday actions. The Biosphere will support a strong local economy based on ecotourism and responsible recreation, where statutory, NGO, business, community and environmental stakeholders work in partnership for a sustainable future. That's high aspiration, and certainly that's happening within Dublin Bay at the moment. So some of the activities that are taking place, we have a Biosphere Award. I know UNESCO are very keen that young people have a voice and a say in biospheres. So we've developed a 3-part Biosphere Award, where we're looking at young people to get outside and experience nature, take a little bit of time to experience what's going on around them, understand the processes that are going on around them. So certainly these webinars help in sharing that knowledge, and then take some form of action to help protect the biosphere. That could be through awareness raising, citizen science projects, or conservation programs. And actually this idea came out of the Isle of Man Biosphere, because they have a scout badge that operates in a similar manner. And we also are running a Biosphere challenge at the moment. It's a 10-week challenge where we're encouraging people to participate in 10 weekly challenges, all of which will build up to help them have a better understanding of our natural heritage, but also do something to help protect it. So the first of the programs was to do nothing. It sounds great, doesn't it? But it was literally put away the lawnmower, spend an hour observing nature, and get a real appreciation of what's around you. And then the second is to grow the wildest flower pot. So it's basically having a flower pot and just see what happens. Not planting it with anything cultivated, and just see what happens. And we're going to have a show at the end of this 10-week program. So you can find more about that on our Facebook page and on the Dublin Bay Biosphere website. Okay, so I'm going to end my sharing now. So I need to go back into window mode. Stop sharing. And I'm going to hand you over to Melinda. Melinda, are you good to go? Fantastic. So I'm going to mute myself and I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you so much.
Okay, hello everybody, welcome, and thank you for coming along. I'm going to just share my screen. Okay. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is the rare habitats on Bull Island and the rare plants they contain. And I suppose if there's one take-home message from the talk, it is that rare plants are rare because their habitats are rare. And by conserving the habitats, that's the best thing that we can do to ensure that we conserve the plants that we're interested in, the things that we think are of conservation value. So I'm going to just run through some of the different plants that you'll find on Bull Island and talk a little bit about the habitats and why these plants are important. Now the strange thing is that my keyboard is not moving the slides. I think I'm going to have to come out of the share and do it again. Okay, let's try. Grand. Okay, so as Dean said, Bull Island is located in the north part of Dublin Bay. Here it is. Here's the city centre over here. So you can see just how close it is to the city centre. There's Dublin Port, and it's sort of hemmed in to the northeast by Howth Head. So Bull Island, like I say, here in the north part of Dublin Bay, there's 2 golf courses on it, so I'm not going to be talking about the areas where the golf courses are, but I'm going to talk to you about some of the other habitats that are outside of the golf courses. So the sort of the main habitats that we have are the foredunes, which are forming at the top of the beach. Then as these become older, they become colonised by marram grass, and a lot of the island is covered in marram grass. It's a very important species in terms of binding the dunes together. But if you look even within the marram dunes, you'll find areas where there is, which are much more colourful and much more diverse in terms of their plants. So we'll look a little bit at some of the dune species. We'll think a little bit about the dune slacks then. Dune slacks are areas that flood in the winter, so they have a very different type of flora. And then finally, I'm going to mention the salt marsh, so that's within the tidal range. Okay, so first of all, I just think this is a great plant to start with because I think it's just so quirky and so characteristic. This is the bee orchid. I think it really is a plant with attitude, and I think it puts a smile on your face every time you see it. So it's an unmistakable species of dry calcareous habitats. It's not confined to the coast. It can be found in inland sites as well, because a lot of dry grassland in lime-rich areas would have an overlap with the kinds of species that you find at the coast. But the sand dunes are still very important for this species. It's very erratic. Some years you can find lots of it, and other years there's next to none. So it varies, the population size varies a lot from year to year. And this species is in decline nationally due to habitat loss. So this is one of the reasons why Bull Island is so important, because a lot of the species that it contains are quite rare in other places. So I've put together a few of these maps. I've taken them from the BSBI data set. And when you look at the maps, what you'll see is, sorry, I just need to make my screen a little bit so I can see it a little bit better. When you look at these maps, what you'll see are is that there are red dots and there are black dots. So the red dots are where there are records for the species before the year 2000, and the black dots are where it has been recorded since 2000. So where you see a lot of red dots, it's an indication. It's not, you know, some of them might be just because they haven't been recorded since 2000, they might still be there, but it is, I think, an indication that there is likely to be a decline in the population. So you can see that there's plenty of red dots for the bee orchid. So it's looking likely that it's in decline, that it's been lost at a lot of sites. And that's one of the reasons why Bull Island is so important for it. Like I say, a lot of the areas of the dunes are colonised by marram grass, which holds the dunes together, and that's really important. But mixed into the marram grass, you find things that are much more colourful. And here there's a lot of pyramidal orchids, which are these purple flowers, and then you have bird's foot trefoil dotted in between. Now these are fairly kind of typical plants of sand dunes and of dry calcareous places. You'll get them both in coastal habitats, but also inland. But a lot of the species that we get on Bull Island are actually much rarer than that. And what you find is that if you look amongst the marram, that it's very often where there's light trampling. If there's very heavy trampling, obviously everything is just going to get killed off. But where there's light trampling, it sets the marram grass back a little bit. And often that's supplemented with rabbit grazing. And what you find then is that you get these areas of low growing vegetation. And if you think about sand dunes, they're a very, very dry habitat. So how do these little plants survive? Well, one of the strategies is that some of them are winter annuals. And what that means is that they start growing in the winter when things are a little bit, everything else has died back a little bit, and when there's likely to be more rain. And if they start growing in the winter, then they're ready to get going as soon as the spring comes. So when spring comes, these things will all burst into flower. They'll flower and they'll set seed very quickly. And that gives them an advantage. It means that they're able to survive on the dry sand dunes. So by the summer, when things get really hot and dry, these plants, you won't really see them. They've disappeared. So if you look really carefully, what you will find is there's these tiny, tiny little plants. So there's the spring vetch is these purple flowers, Vitiolatheroides, and the early forget-me-not is these little blue, you see the blue flower there, and the hairy heads on them. You can see how small they are because some rabbit droppings beside. And rabbits are actually quite important in maintaining this kind of habitat. Now, if you look at these species on the map, you'll find that unlike the bee orchid, these things are almost entirely confined to the coast. And you can see again a lot of red dots, which means that it's likely that they've been lost from a number of sites, and therefore the sites where they remain are really important. This is another little one that fits into that same category. It's only a few centimeters tall. This is early sandgrass. and it's only known from Barley Cove in West Cork and from Bull Island. So some of these plants are really tiny, but they're very, very important in terms of conservation. We have to, we have to keep an eye out for them. We need to know where they are and sort of monitor how they're doing. And this one is on the red list as vulnerable because it's so, there's only the 2 populations of it known. So those were all things of dry dune slacks. They grow in very dry places. But one of the things that makes Bull Island really interesting is the variety of different habitat types. And the different conditions at different parts of the island is really important. So dune slacks are areas that are low-lying within the sand dune system, and they flood during the winter. So this is part of the dune slack system on Bull Island. This is part of the South Slacks, and very often during the winter the water levels can rise up, and they can be quite, the slacks can be under quite deep water, which can last there for a few months. And this is important because it sets back a lot of the bigger plants, a lot of the more robust vegetation. So marram grass, for instance, won't grow in the flooded areas, and that makes space for other plants. And that's really important for some of the rare plants. So if you look at the dune slack in the winter and compare it to what you find in the summer, and you can see in the bottom photograph, the water has receded and the place is full of these little pink orchids. So these little pink orchids are the early marsh orchid, Dactylorhiza incarnata, subspecies coccinea, a distinctive orchid of dune slacks. This particular subspecies, this particular colour of orchid and the stature of the orchid is very distinctive. It seems to be confined to Ireland and Britain, and therefore the populations in Ireland are of international significance. Now that's just one species that you get in the dune slacks, but there's a whole lot of others. There's things like the marsh helleborine, this beautiful orchid. I saw Dean had it up on a slide earlier on. The flowers are just really, really absolutely stunningly beautiful, and so interesting to look at the way that they're put together. And while orchids are the sort of the highly evolved end of the scale, at the other end of the scale, very low in the evolutionary scale of things, we have things like Equisetum variegatum, which isn't a flowering plant at all. It's a horsetail, and it reproduces by spores, which are in these little capsules at the tips. But both quite rare plants and in decline due to habitat loss. And this one over here, the autumn gentian, Gentianella amarella, is on the red list as near threatened. And you can see on the map there that there's a lot more red dots than there are black dots. So unfortunately, it just looks like this, former sites where this plant would have been present seem to have been lost. Different parts of Bull Island provide suitable habitat for different plants. So even though all of these are associated with dune slacks, some of them, like the Equisetum variegatum, are all in the south half of the island in the South Slacks, and others are in the Alder Marsh, which is on the north half of the island. So even though these are dune slack species, they don't all occur in the same types of dune slack. Some of them like something that's a little bit wetter or a little bit drier, and there's a pH difference as well between the north end and the south end of the island. So that probably has an effect, as well as the age of the dunes and lots of different things. So they're very choosy in where they live. This, again, another beautiful species, autumn lady's tresses, Spiranthes spiralis, grows in the Alder Marsh. There's very few plants there. You'd be very lucky if you find 10 or 12 plants in any given year, and they're also tiny, so you have to get down on your hands and knees and really search for them. Again, you can see on the map that these are plants that are in decline. They've been lost from a lot of the places where they were known to occur in the past. A rare moss, Drepanocladus centneri. This one is Bull Island is the only known place for this in the east of Ireland. Other than that, it's all the populations of it are in towards the west, over in Galway, Mayo, and along the Shannon. So very important. I'm afraid this is one of the sad things to report, is that there was a lot of damage actually done to that very area, to this area where the Drepanocladus is, and to the dune slacks that I showed you earlier on. There was a lot of damage done to that last week. Actually, you might have heard that there was a building demolished, and unfortunately the machines drove through the dune slack and they've caused a great deal of damage to it. It's a real pity, because it's one of the areas where so many of those rare species were living, and they're very small populations as it is, and clearly they can't withstand that kind of intrusion on their habitat. So it's a real pity to see that. So to move on then to the salt marsh is a different type of habitat again. The dune slacks are a freshwater habitat. So when they flood in the winter, they're flooded with fresh water, not with salt water. But plants that live close to the edge of where the tide comes in are living on the salt marsh. So the salt marsh is flooded at high tide, and then when the tide goes out, it's exposed to the air again. So this creates a kind of a zonation on the salt marsh because depending on how high the tide is, it may cover just the lower part of the salt marsh, or it may come all the way up to the top. And this creates conditions that suit some plants and not others. But one of the plants that's really spectacular out on Bull Island is the rock sea lavender, Limonium binervosum. And when it's in flower, it's quite spectacular. There's a huge swathe of it up at the north end of the island, and it's really, really quite beautiful. But again, you can see on the map that this particular species, in the strict sense, this there's closely related species, but in the strict sense, this species is a very, very limited distribution. So again, Bull Island is a really important place for it. And this one then is the legally protected lesser century Centurion pulchellum, another species that you find at the top of the salt marsh, absolutely tiny. You need to be down on your hands and knees looking for that. And this one is on the Flora Protection Order because it's considered to be near threatened in Ireland. So just to finish up, oh sorry, that's a photograph that some years it's a little bit bigger, so it was having a good year in that photograph at the bottom left, but very often it's really just a few centimetres and you can barely find it. So just to finish off then, when you look at the island, you can see the red dots represent the rare species, the ones that I've shown you, as well as a few others as well. So altogether, there's 5 legally protected species, there's 11 red list species, and there's another 34 species which don't quite fall into the first 2 categories, but nevertheless, there are things like the bee orchid, like Epipactis, the marsh helleborine. They're all things that are in decline, and therefore Bull Island is very important for them. So rare plants require very specialised habitats. These conditions in themselves are rare, and conserving the rare habitats is of the utmost importance to address biodiversity loss. So that's all I have to say to you. Thank you.
Melinda, thank you very much. That's fantastic. That's really, really interesting. Very disappointed to learn about the damage that was caused to North Bull Island. And whilst you were finishing off the presentation, I was sending an email to a colleague to find out some information on that, because yeah, that's not helpful at all with the work that we're trying to do to help safeguard these areas. So thank you for that. Now we're going to hand over to Nolene. Nolene, are you good and ready there?
Yeah,
you want
great.
me to share my screen, I believe, because we need to share my presentation, or your presentation that I have here. So give me one second. I'm just going to share screen. Here we go. Let's put it up here. Can everyone see that? Hello?
Yeah, I can see it anyway, Dean. Yeah, I don't know other people.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll hand over to you, and if you maybe just let me know when you want to go to the next slide.
Thanks so much, Dean, and I'm sorry to put you under this pressure. I just had one of those unmitigated disasters of presentations. So thank you so much to Melinda for doing that wonderful overview. And I think I'm very lucky to actually be living in Dublin Bay Biosphere. And I'm going to tell you maybe some more stories of plants and people from places that I've interacted with in the biosphere. So this is just the picture there of the orchid and the person and the house. This is one of the coastal walks in Malahide, which is not actually in the core of the biosphere, but in the buffer. So just to show that people and plants and buildings are all interacting within this biosphere, which I think is quite interesting. Yeah, so if you want to move on there, dear Dean. So I suppose the real challenge is like for plants to grow. So here's just an image of, a plant going through concrete. So in the past, like coastal areas, so I'm a horticulturist by trade, but I'm also a botanist. So when I done horticulture, like planting by the coast was a real challenge. So there was always lists of plant species to plant by the coast. And I'm going to show you one plant that was used for hedging, which is causing a bit of an issue on Bull Island. Then I'm going to maybe take you to maybe some of the plants that people have planted in their gardens in Howth, which are now posing a challenge to the special area of conservation out there. And then I'm just going to talk a little bit about flower power and obviously when, where and what to kind of plant. You know, when you live in a biosphere, we have a little bit more responsibility, I feel, as to what we plant in our gardens, because the fence is not quite as solid as it was. We're cheek by jowl now with the natural world, and so really I think we really need to think about our planting in urban areas. Yeah, so thanks. If you want to move on there. So this was probably one of the first plants I learned on my coastal planting list, and this is Hippophae rhamnoides, and this is one of the ones recommended for hedging on coastal sites in the past. So I think Melinda sort of referenced the golf course. So all along the edge of the golf course, in order to keep the golfers nice and cozy and not to have them blown off the golf courses, they planted this thing, which is sea buckthorn, and it's a most excellent hedge. It's nice and spiny. It grows really quick. So that was great when they planted it. However, sea buckthorn really loved living on Bull Island, and it started to spread, you know, really rapidly throughout Bull Island. So if you want to move on there again. So this is a nice PDF put together by Marianne Harris in the Dublin City Council, and I think it was a study by Tim Ryle, who's going to talk to us next. And this goes back and was like North Bull Island Management Plan in 2009. And really Tim and his colleague Mark there highlighted like that sea buckthorn was not only spreading, but it fixes nitrogen. You know, there's a lot of vegetation caused shading, and then when it drops its leaves, it kind of enriches the soil. And then also the alteration of groundwater tables in the vicinity of the alder marsh. So you might say, okay, yeah, well, why is that a bad thing? We're getting fertilizer here. We've got lots more plants growing. This isn't so bad. But if you just want to go to the next slide then. And I apologize for these terrible images of one of the issues I had. So when the alder marshes, there's evidence for them starting to dry out. And as Melinda just showed, some of the ones that are not flowers, these little mosses, Drepanocladus there. But this is a group with Christina here, Christina Campbell, who works in the National Botanic Gardens, Neil Lockhart, Deirdre Lynn from National Parks and Wildlife. And this is an international bryophyte expert, David Hollyoak, who was out showing us some of the populations, and they were really quite radically reduced due to drying out. And one of them is this little Petalophyllum ravsii, which is, we have to report to Europe every 6 years how this little Petalophyllum is actually doing. And Christina Campbell done her whole PhD on a suite of species, but this was one of them. So Petalophyllum is kind of interesting. In 1 year there was only 9 little talus counted, so you can kind of see the tip of the biro how difficult they are. So this is the only site on the east coast of Ireland for this. They used to grow in Malahide, and I think over on a bait there was another site. So this is our only site on the east coast for this tiny little liverwort. So it's really very magic and very special. And this group, I think Christina came up with the name of bryophyters. So it was kind of fighting for these tiny little plants that maybe not many people are aware of or even care about. So Bull Island, very important for that plant. Okay, going to move on. So this is another kind of area that I've been involved with in the biosphere. This is a plant called Carpobrotus edulis, which is a South African, and you can kind of see it's a very pretty flower. So people have been planting this in their gardens since the 1950s. So it's very exotic, very beautiful, and it loves living kind of in the nice, warm, dry places such as Howth Head, which is in the biosphere as well. So if you just want to move on to the next one. So it's got key features. So if you're out walking around, it's a good idea to watch out for it and maybe to kind of record it. It's a very distinctive kind of plant. So it grows on the Lizard Peninsula and Cornwall as well. So it kind of smothers the whole of there as well. So it's causing issues around the world. In California, it's causing issues. So it originally started in South Africa, but when plants kind of are brought to a new home by people, they settle in because sometimes they're free of pests and diseases from where they originally come from, and they can spread away. So Carpobrotus really likes living on Howth Head, and they're just all the features, and it's a good idea to maybe record and watch for them if you're out and about on a walk. Yeah, so if you want to move on. So we done a survey actually in, I think, God, it must be 2009, 2010, just looking at all the different patches of Carpobrotus out in Howth. So you can see some of them behind this little house. It's contained within a garden. You can kind of see the garden fence is really just a couple of posts. But so it's actually spread to kind of right in front of the house. So the garden would have been the source for this. So in front of the wall is all the area within the special area of conservation in Howth. So this is kind of the issue when plants kind of jump the garden fence here. So you can see that, so the huge kind of patch that looks like a lawn behind the house is Carpobrotus, and the patch in front of the wall is also Carpobrotus. So if you want to move on there. It's also growing on some of these cliffs around Needles and Doldrum Bay. So you can kind of see these big sheets of it. It really likes taking off. So it's quite distinctive when you see it. You will really notice it if you're doing that cliff walk in Howth, which is particularly beautiful. So if you want to move on again. So we started looking at how we might control Carpobrotus, so the ones that have escaped from gardens into the special area of conservation. So we tried various chemicals, and we're still trying various things. So in the past, I suppose we looked really a lot to kind of minimizing, you know, the amount of chemical. So one of the ideas was that we would pull it off the cliffs, and but then it's hazardous waste and it's quite heavy. People might fall into the sea. So then we kind of went for, you know, maybe we could pull it off and just let it float in the sea. But then a project in Menorca had done that, and all the seabirds took it back in to build their nests. So not only did they kind of break it out to sea, but they brought it up to higher places in Menorca. So really, when we kind of looked at it, our only option then was a chemical option, where we needed to be very sure that when we would put chemical on, that it would actually kill and not kill anything else. So we looked at various chemicals, and we've written some papers and reports on that I can share later. So if you want to just move on there. And so this was, we ended up using a thing called Resolva, which is quite a noxious chemical. I suppose now we're looking for alternatives to Resolva at the moment. But the thing is, it was such, it was a one-stop shop. When we sprayed it, really you're just spraying the sheet of Carpobrotus. There's no native species impacted. And then what we got, which was coming back through the Carpobrotus stems, you can see the dead Carpobrotus stems there. And you can see these rare plants, this Inula critmoides, was just below the surface there, so came through the old Carpobrotus stems, which was fantastic, and this lovely rock samphire. So it really shows that we really have to kind of get in and deal with invasive species in special areas of conservation, because, you know, the seed bank mightn't last so long if the whole place is swamped. Yeah, and once you still have, so it was very good. We had very good results in the SAC in Howth using that chemical, but we're not looking now, as I say, to using kind of more alternative methods. So if you want to move on. The other thing I noticed more closer to home, so that was the story of Howth and the hedging. So I think a real trend at the moment, definitely around where I live in Swords, is really to start growing wildflowers. So a lot of people want to sow wildflowers to save our bees, which is fantastic, because a third of our bees are threatened with extinction. And so often when I see some of these things, bees actually have quite short tongues. So they really like these kind of open flowers. So they love kind of dandelions. So, and they also come out early in the year. You often see a lot of the planted wildflowers kind of around this time of the year, but the bees have lots of choice in the summer. It's really early in the year. So just highlighting to you that, you know, something as humble as the old dandelion there that comes out early in the year is very important for our native bees. So if you want to move on there. So this is, I kind of ranted because I was going off looking at various wildflower packets. So, and I kind of realized that people were buying these wildflower packets thinking they were buying Irish wildflowers, but really in a blog here I highlighted that it's a fantasy really, that a lot of these cornflowers in the packets are not of Irish origins, they're European, and some packets don't even tell us. Some of the calendulas, it's been, nobody even knows where it grows in the wild anymore. Some of the poppies, European, they're mixed in with cosmos from Mexico, again, Southern European borage, stuff like that. So these are all exotic species, and these are kind of what people are planting as wildflowers. So we just want to move on there. So really, as I said, they're not Irish wild. They're not wild. Many instances, they're not found in the wild. They're not harvested from the wild. So really, what these things are just flower mixes. So as I said, there's lots of them around the place. So just to make people aware, because I don't think people really were aware of that kind of thing. So if you want to just move on again. So these are fine in your garden because these are flower mixes. So I would say that most of the flower mixes for sale have species that just flower in the summer when there's lots of food for the bees already. So really you need to be out early in the year if you want to kind of help out the bees, and late. And I've seen people taking out a lot of road verges. So that nice coastal stretch that I showed you with the orchid and the person walking near Malahide, people are taking out coastal habitat like that around Dublin and planting in these exotic wildflower mixes. So actually doing more harm than good to our biodiversity in the biosphere. And just also to highlight that these verges are quite important. There's a picture there from a verge in the north of Ireland, but if you walk any of our coastal paths at the moment, you'll see how beautiful, there's lots of wild carrot and flower, lots of orchids, that pyramidal orchid. They're stunning. We really don't need to be ripping them out and improving them. And I think we all like to do something where we naturally want to get involved and do something. But just to say to you that in a lot of instances, maybe planting these packets is actually impacting negatively on the bees and also very negatively on our own native coastal wildflowers. So if you want to just move on there again. And so I would just say to people, just see what you have before you start stripping the bank. There's lots of neighbourhood groups and tidy town groups, and often everybody rows in to dig up the spot. So the thing is, you might already have lots of Irish wildflowers there already. They mightn't be as pretty or as shiny or as colourful as the ones in the packets, but we do actually already have a lot of wildflowers existing on these kind of fringes. And I think it's quite important now because that fence is quite loose between the garden and definitely on Howth, the fence between the garden and the special area conservation is so narrow. And so we really have to just check what we already have before we move on. And then also that weed is a plant growing in the wrong place. So as you see with that Carpobrotus from South Africa, inside that person's garden, the wild plants would be the weed, but outside that person's garden, the Carpobrotus is the weed. So it's just that a weed is a plant in the wrong place. So there's lots of plants swapping over and in the wrong place. So if you want to just move on. And just to highlight that a lot of our cornflowers and a lot of our actual Irish flowers are under extinct. So we see a lot of these in the wildflower mixes, but very few of them could even be sourced in Ireland because there's only like one field, I think, in Clare, as in a recent record paper in 2015. So a lot of what we see are exotic, and these are really only suitable for wood inside your garden. Yeah, so if you want to move on. And as I said, support places with Irish wildflowers, and they in turn support our biodiversity, and that's very important within our biosphere. And if you just want to move on there. And thanks a mil for listening. The All Ireland Pollinator Plan have lots of information. I'm also on the Natural Capital Ireland steering group. So there's lots of great resources there and everyone can sign up. So it's basically valuing nature, that nature has this value that we really need to start. For people, I think during lockdown, we all have got a lot of value from our areas, and definitely around Dublin and Dublin Bay, Biosphere, we really I definitely have appreciated living within this wonderful place, this great city. Thank you.
That was brilliant, Nolene. It's really interesting to hear, our impacts when we think we're doing the right thing. I mean, a lot of tiny towns groups are out there. They're doing, fantastic work, maintaining their local environments and wanting to enhance the local environments. And they think that they're doing the right thing. And in fact, they're causing more problems. So this is really important. This is why we need these kind of webinars to share that information, get that message out there. So I really appreciate it. I'm delighted that you touched on that. So our final expert is Tim there. Hi, Tim.
Good afternoon.
Are you all set to go?
I am indeed, yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to be quiet and hand over to you. Thanks very much.
You might just let me know if that has, if that has come up. Oh, it has, yeah.
Perfect. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks to Melinda and to Nolene for their talks. Unfortunately, both of them took the two areas that I would have loved to have covered. So I've decided to take a slightly different tack, and this is a very personal tour. So you may or may not agree with me. Anything I say is a personal view and it doesn't reflect on anybody else. But most of you are aware of what the biosphere is. And there's just a small zone. The core zone is typically the estuarine and the coastal areas. I'm not going to concentrate on that because I don't want the general public going looking for these rarities or plants of interest. I don't want you climbing in the sea, and some of them are a lot harder to find. So really, we will focus on the buffer and the transition. And as the previous speakers have already said, we're smack in the middle of Dublin. We have a lot of industrial, residential and recreational influences impacting what we have. But we were very, very lucky in that we still have areas of green space. We still have quite a large number of habitats, you know, many of which would be captured across Ireland. There's very few that we don't have. We've very few, you know, Arctic alpine cliffs. We don't have a similar area to the Burren, but really we do have a lot of these habitats. And it's within these habitats that I want people to have a look. And I've picked out a few plants, but I'm not necessarily going to give you detailed maps or location specific information. It's really I don't know, it's just a little tour to have a look out when you're out and about. The first point there, my whole presentation is summarized in this slide, really. The biosphere captures coastal waters, and that there's quite a number of conservation designations, but notwithstanding that, it's the plants, to me, as a botanist, that are important. A lot of the plants across Dublin and the biosphere aren't confined to single habitats, but we've already seen that there are some rarities, and they will be quite rare. So we're going to avoid those, but we're very, very lucky that we have them at our doorstep within these urbanized centres. I'm not going to focus on Bull Island because Melinda has covered that nicely, and she's shown some beautiful photographs, although there may be one or two plants that I'll talk about. And I'm not going to talk about non-natives, although there will be at least one, but thankfully Nolene didn't cover it. Okay, it's a whistle-stop tour. My own choice of plants. There's no rhyme, no reason to the habitats or to the areas or to the choice, but it's largely terrestrial. There's at least one aquatic plant there. There's lots and lots of plants, and I came up with this kind of hodgepodge of plants after talking to one of my colleagues, Alexis, who has done a lot of surveying. I have done a fair bit of survey in the past, but more and more I don't do as much botanical survey, and I have along the coast, so he's more up to date. So I very much thank Alexis, who is a county recorder in Monaghan, but has done a lot in Dublin on rare plants and stuff like that. And then finally, it's just naturally terms and conditions apply. So you take what I say as you want. There is a considerable amount of floristic diversity across the biosphere. Ireland, at very high level, and don't quote me on these, you know, the infamous Professor Webb would say 815 native plant species in Ireland. And if you take aliens and stuff like that, that could go up to, across Ireland, around 1,200 species. Not all of them persistent, but they're fascinating. The biosphere has a considerable number of annex habitats. That's a European designation. Mostly the coastal, salt marsh and sand dunes, so we've covered them. And they have some lovely species. One of the smallest, and Nolene's already shown a picture with the pen tip, is the diminutive petalwort found on Bull Island. I'm not going to tell you where it is. I'm not going to say much about it, but you can see that it is quite small. In the picture there's the remains of a bit of marram grass beside it. So you can see that it is diminutive, a historical plant. We're not going to talk any more about that. We're going to focus on, obviously, the transition and the buffer zones, because they're the most areas that are typically used by us humans, whether living, working, or as recreational, and that includes the coast, but we'll avoid them. The key thing in influencing this is obviously urbanization, because it reduces habitats. It increases the potential spread of, say, garden escapees, the introductions of aliens. How is the flora developing? We also get the fascinating introductions by visitors coming in and commercial activities on land or by water, including ballast water, or coming in through the harbours and ports and stuff like that. You know, in the old days, the stevedores, that's where a lot of these more recent introductions would have come from. But in terms of plant species, the biosphere is not a static unit. There are plants coming and going. There are some fascinating plants. Some of them are good, not all. And it depends on what people plant in their gardens as well, is to me is a key focus on how these go. First thing I'd like to say, it's very few areas of true wilderness other than the sea and underwater, right? There are areas of semi-natural wilderness, either managed or long established. Some are small, some are big, and some are being developed as local authorities and others try and manage them sensibly, hopefully, and don't overplant and things like that. They are managed, and while they try to recreate an element of naturalness, it's not always successful. So some of the places that we'll talk about will be interesting by virtue of dereliction. So sometimes these are the areas, and they're relatively small. So always keep an eye out there when you're looking for the plants. And some of the more interesting plants come up on transport corridors. So, but very often Dublin Port was a key area for alien plants, and some of these plants, how they started. But in historical times, as people came from other countries back to Ireland through the ports and stuff like that, with straw or hay as to hold all their produce, they contained seed sources, and these eventually could have dropped out. But with containerization, there's possibly an argument for the slowdown of the introduction of species via that channel, but we still have them nonetheless, and they're still fascinating. And so one of the key areas to have a look at is always go around Dublin Port and look at these little pockets of soil in against concrete and stuff like that. You never know what you might find, and you certainly might not find it in the wider area. So the key areas: dereliction, the understudied areas that you can't get in at, inaccessible, and that's useful because it in one sense it helps some of these plants, but it's not always the case. But finally, before we start, be forewarned, don't be expecting like a tropical rainforest, big showy plants all the time. There are some, but a lot of them are small, and it does mean that sometimes you have to really keep the eye out, and if you're very, very lucky, you'll see a little flower, or you do have to get down on your hands and knees. There's no two ways about it. So here's my whistle-stop tour, and I will put my hand up and say that none of the photographs today are of my own. All my photographs are locked away on a computer that's locked down in Wexford, unfortunately, so I don't have access to it. So I have cheekily taken most of my photographs, the bulk bar 2, from the Wildflowers of Ireland website. Zoe Devlin's absolutely excellent resource, and for that I thank her in advance for that. But they really do show some of the plants that I've decided to talk on. So the first one I picked out, and unfortunately Melinda beat me to it, was the bee orchid. So I won't talk about Bull Island. It is a distinctive orchid. You know, it is on these nice grasslands. One of the things I want you to look at is look at the flower. What does the flower look like? Do you think it gives the name of the bee? That's how a lot of our orchids actually get their names, because it relates to the plant or to the species that pollinate them. So it looks like the backside of a bee, and it's a very delicate plant, but it's beautiful. But it's not just on Bull Island. It has been found in other areas, up to 60 specimens near the M50 and some other green areas around Dublin, all within the biosphere. So fascinating plant. It is under threat. Okay, so if you see it, I would ask that you don't touch it. Don't pick it up, leave it alone, let it do its thing. But what's so fascinating also about bee orchids, all orchids in fact, is they rarely reappear where you find them one year. So if you see an orchid in a spot and you come back the next year, they may or may not come up, or they may have moved, triffid-like, if you will. And that's all to do with the root system. They have these little double tuberous roots, and they're the fungal symbionts. So the underground mycelia of mushrooms help them generally, and that they can move around. So they are fascinating little species like that. Keep an eye out. It is one of the most pretty plants that you will see, and if you're very, very lucky. The next one's not so pretty, but everybody is aware of white clover. This is a recent introduction to the Irish flora. It's not a new species, but it had never been recorded until 1979, so it made its debut. It looks like white clover, but it's typically a lot smaller. The flowers are a lot smaller, so there's a picture there. The clusters are quite small relative to the clover. It's found rarely within more than 100 meters of the coast, where it's found on the typical types of soil, and it's shallow calcareous soils. Very often they're drought, so that there's thin soils and there's not a lot of water. On the eastern and southeastern coast, that's about all I'm going to give you on the distribution. So I don't want, if you see it, leave it alone. If you were to get down on it, it is very rare in Dublin. It is found on at least one island, and it's quite popular in that botanists are busy going around trying to look for it and extend its distribution, by virtue of it is so rare. But it does, funnily enough, at this particular site, it overlaps with another rarity, which is the rough clover, which looks exactly like it. So you really have to get down on your hands and knees with the hand lens to really pick up these. So not a showy plant, as I said, but nonetheless a rarity, and a recent rarity within the biosphere. A lot of people will be aware of charlock and mustards and things like that, particularly on disturbed ground and places like that. This is one which it's long established, but it is a rarity, the eastern rocket. And it's in the cabbage family. There's a small flower that's yellow, 4 petals, so they are common enough. Its lower leaves are halberd, as you can see there, so it's an interesting feature to help identify it. It was found around manure works in Dublin, so it's long established, 1904, but it was quite rare. Its distribution has spread, but it is quite limited, and it seems to be diminishing by virtue of it is an agricultural weed, and like that. We don't have lots of manure lying around within the biosphere areas and places like that. So the question there is, are other brassicas, other cabbage-like plants in disturbed areas where we do roadworks and that, where you see them coming up in big swathes, are they overtaking this plant, or has it been the increased use in pesticides and the reduction in the habitat, which has led to the reduction of this plant? If you find it, it's a nice rarity, and if you're absolutely certain, I would ask that people put in these records, even as citizen science, on the Biodiversity Centre, the MBDC website, so that at least we know it's spread and we can keep an eye on it. A lovely plant. Very small plant. You're all aware of your garden geraniums. This is a C version, the C storksbill. Now the upper picture is it. As you can see, it's on a bit of shingle there, so it's very small. You can't see any flowers, although there are flowers inside there. They're minute. The more common version is the second photograph. And again, it's still prostrate, not as big. It's rare. It's typically in grazed areas. Now, it's not just on shingle. It is actually on grassland and like that. Typically, it's a species that likes these warm areas, so the southeast coast of Ireland. But it is found in 1 or 2 places in Ireland, not just on islands, but also inland within the biosphere. Fascinating species, most likely overlooked by most people, because it's quite a specialized habitat. The next one is, I decided it's a fascinating plant. It's a parasite. They have no true chlorophyll. They have colorism, as you can see from that photograph there. That's the ivy broomrape. They have no true chlorophyll, so they can't photosynthesize. So how do they survive? How do they reproduce? Well, underground, they attach themselves to other plants and they suck the nutrients out of them. The colors that you see in the plant are other colors like beta carotenes and things like that, but they have no true flower colors like that. The name of the plant, there's about 5 typical broomrapes across Ireland, and a number of them occur in the biosphere, but the name usually gives away the host plant. So the ivy one is very common, but there's a few others, the thyme, the wild, and things like that. If you're going to look for these, and please don't pick them because they are fascinating, but they are lovely to see and they're quite distinctive. You typically look in areas that are at the edge of wooded areas, and there's a range of them, and there's a number of different areas there. So they're not necessarily rare, but they are a fascinating species within the flora of the biosphere, and they add to the biodiversity, and they're quite useful and a beautiful plant in their own right. I said I'd talk about one aquatic species. The reality is most of us, even in our day-to-day, or even as botanists, are not going to spend too much time looking at this particular plant or even trying to find it because it's submerged most of the time. It is a flora protection order species. It's legally protected. Across the country, it's confined to the southern half of Ireland, but it is diminishing and it's not doing so well in some places. But funnily enough, it is locally abundant on the canals within Dublin and down towards the sea and stuff like that. Fascinating picture. Its limited distribution, some tidal estuaries, it's found in tidal estuaries down in Wexford and places like that. It is thriving. And the funny thing about this, it's one of these species that, despite the fact that the canals are dredged every now and again to increase navigation or just to cut back on some of the overgrowth, this plant still survives and does quite well. That doesn't mean that all plants do well with interference by human management and activities, but this one does, because it's very often when it's not submerged in the water, it's buried under the mud, so it does well like that. But it's a hard species to find, and if you see it, all the more better. because it's doing very, very well. You know, its strong point would be within the biosphere and in the canals. Not many more to go now. I decided to pick this one, the henbane. It's a rare coastal plant. Disturbed coastal areas, kind of shingle, grasslands and stuff like that. It is near threatened, but it's a very easy plant to identify. It doesn't really stand out. If you look at in the picture there, those white petals, but if you look closely at it, there's a central purple eye and there's a lot of this purple venation. So it's a tall plant, about 80 centimeters. Most of the others I've shown you are a lot smaller, but it's fascinating. But one of its apparent characteristic features is its malodorous nature. It's quite hunky. It does belong to the potato family, and funnily enough, quite a number of the potato family, the family Solanaceae, would be toxic, including things like deadly nightshade. And henbane was said to have killed a number of people, both in real life or in literature. So Hamlet's father was killed by the juice of the Cursita bona, which some people reckon was a concoction made out of the henbane. So it is a it is, thankfully, it is, well, in one sense, so that people don't hurt themselves, it is diminishing, but it is grown under cultivation, and it's in a plant. It's funny how plants that are toxic or fatal in real life contain many compounds that are of great use to people. And this one has, the henbane has a number of compounds which are used in commercial analgesics and pain relief and stuff like that. So a useful plant, even though strictly toxic. I said I wouldn't really deal with habitats, but I have to deal with this because it brings in Booterstown Marsh, or the lagoon in South County Dublin, which is a landlocked lagoon brought about by the development of the Dublin-Dunleary railway line, the second railway line built in the British Isles. It is a brackish marsh. It's hypersaline by virtue of sometimes they forget to open the gate and flood the seawater in. So there's a lot of habitats, quite brackish, but notwithstanding that, there are a number of annexed habitats, salt marsh habitats within there. But Booterstown Marsh is probably more well known for the range of winter birds and birds that it supports. It's regarded as the only salt marsh in South County Dublin. That's probably not wholly true, because there's a new, what I would call proto-salt marsh developing onto the seaward side of Booterstown, down near Merrion Gates. There's small bits of salt marsh and sand dunes. But within that, under our doorsteps, is this plant up the top. The one in the photograph on the bottom is the common seagrass, common in most salt marshes, and it's usually prostrate. It's sometimes upright, but you can see it's kind of wiry and stuff like that. It's quite distinctive. There's very few other grasses occurring in the same area as this particular grass. But in Booterstown Marsh, we have this rarity here, the Borer salt marsh grass, and it's long established. It's a small plant, kind of tufted like this. It's a flora protection order because it's quite rare. It's really only known from a number of Mediterranean salt marsh communities. Now, Ireland isn't in the Mediterranean, but under European kind of habitats and classifications, we do have Atlantic and Mediterranean salt marshes, including the Barrow Estuary and places like that down in Wexford. But Booterstown Marsh, by virtue of this, is classed as Atlantic/Mediterranean. So think of it as you will. Fascinating one. It's not a showy grass. It is small, and I'm not encouraging anybody to go out onto the nature reserve. It is treacherous, so leave it alone. It's doing no harm to you, but nonetheless, a fascinating species, one which is not widely distributed around Ireland. So we're very, very lucky to have it within the biosphere. And there's only 2 more really species to go. It is a non-native. It's a third schedule. It's a fascinating plant. I said most of our plants wouldn't be showy, but this one here, it's slightly stretched. But in reality, 2.5 meters to 4 meters tall, those leaves. If you go to the west of Ireland, you can stand under them. You could use it as an umbrella if you had gloves on your hand to hold the plants. They're quite prickly. It was a fascinating architectural plant that really spread from Victorian gardens. More recently, in the past 20, 30 years, it really has been a considerable spread, I think, in the West by virtue of infrastructure and dereliction of old, smaller fields, but also where they're, in Connemara, where they're widening some of the smaller roads because of increased traffic, poor biosecurity and not cleaning machinery and stuff like that. Where you dig up this plant, if you can see, here is a flowering spike, thousands and thousands of seeds, quite distinctive. but they can result in the spread of this plant, and it grows deep, so it's very, very hard to eradicate. We find it in Dublin, you know, it is more recently in the East Wall Business Park, but also along the River Dodder in places. And there was a garden centre that used to sell this that backed onto the Dodder. So it is a fascinating plant. People still have it. It's not encouraged. Don't encourage you to pick it. I don't encourage you to grow it. In land, it is a third scheduled species, so it should be dealt with accordingly. There is a statutory obligation on people not to cause its spread. It is non-native, and one of the reasons that it's so difficult, if you were of mind to plant it, once it gets underground, it's very, very hard. It goes deep, and even modern machinery find it very, very difficult. Now, the only other ways to deal with it include chemicals, but we won't go into that. But nonetheless, a fascinating species and tall. So keep an eye out for it, particularly along the Dodder. You know, it really stands out from everything else. And then the final plant that I wanted to talk about is not really a rarity, but it's a fun plant, I think, one that kids love to talk about when you do little courses with them like that. It's the navelwort, or umbilicus, and there's the picture there of it like that. Wort is a fascinating. It's from the Old English, which meant a body part. So if you think about plants, even some of your garden plants, lungwort, things like this, that's where you get it. But it also has a second meaning. Wort was a very old English name for a plant. It is a distinctive looking plant. Hopefully you might know what a foxglove looks like, with its typically purple but sometimes white pink flowers. It's a tall spike with these little fingerless flowers. This is a smaller version like that. The flower is not exactly the same, but it is on a spike. But even without the flowers, it's an annual species, so it's not there all year. But even without the flowers, if you look at the little fleshy leaves, that's where it gets its name from. It looks like a small belly button, and kids, for some reason, anytime you go out with them trying to teach them bits and pieces of plants, they love looking at this. They love squeezing it and wondering what comes out of a belly button, will lint or anything like that. So it is a fascinating species. It is quite restricted in its distribution, in that keep an eye out for it on rocky screes and on rock faces and places like that. So it's an interesting one to look out for. And with that, that was my little tour of some plants of Dublin Bay, and I hope that was interesting. So thank you very much indeed.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Tim. There's a couple of notes I've made. One was on the poisonous plant and the medicinal value. I mean, this is why we need to safeguard these plants, I guess, because there are potentially unknown medicinal values of some of these plants. Some of the old plants have medicinal value that would have been used in kind of home natural remedies and have been forgotten. So, you know, that's an interesting element. You mentioned the biodiversity data center and the records, and this is how ordinary citizens can support the protection of these species by recording anything that they find on the biodiversity data center website. I mean, is that something you would encourage?
I absolutely would. The more information that's out there, citizen science or professional science, it's useful for trying to understand, when people are trying to understand a particular area. But it gives us a better feel for, hopefully over time, proper management of plants, or if we know where the hotspots are, where we might focus our activities, because obviously money and management will always be tight when it comes to biodiversity. So if we know that there's something there, at least others can keep an eye out for it. And even citizen science, if it's an unvouched, somebody can keep an eye out for it, the BSBI or professional ecologist or anybody, keep an eye on it. And the more records that come on that, it gives us an idea of how a plant is thriving, because we don't really have a lot of monitoring information for plants. You know, some of it can be quite academic at times, and it's hard to find that information. So I don't mean that for people to go out and look for a plant and then pick it. I would never advocate the picking of plants, particularly if you don't know what it is. Even if you think it's quite common, if you don't know what it is, photograph it maybe. Take a note of characteristics, but please don't pick it until you're absolutely certain. And certainly there are places in Ireland where it is illegal to pick wildflowers anyway. Say, for example, the burren.
I mean, you may be able to help me here. If you're taking a record of a plant and you've taken a photograph, you have the ability to upload that image on the biodiversity data website so that they can, an expert like Nolene, yourself, or Melinda can, you know, clarify. Is that right?
Yes, and the Heritage Centre do that. They sometimes they will put in a record, and sometimes if it's unvouched and they have a photograph, they will put it up there. So in that it has its intrinsic value.
Brilliant.
But usually, if it was a real rarity, you could be sure that people who are doing research or professional ecologists that are doing desktop studies for writing environmental impact assessments, they need to know what's there before they do their own surveys. They'd be keeping an eye out for it, and that they would be hotspots that people would be looking for. Now, very often the records don't bring you down to a grid reference, particularly if it's a rarity, and that is another thing. While you may give that information to the Biodiversity Centre, they may not publish it, wisely so.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to go to the Q&As because we're encouraging our visitors to ask any questions, and we've a few that's come through. I'm going to go to the bottom one there. We've got a question from Sean Muldoon. Is it possible to get a copy of Tim's presentation?
It possibly might be, but I need to.
It might be.
As in, they're not my photographs. So
Yeah.
even though I showed them up, I don't think we could issue them yet. I would need to get permission, or I would need to try and get vouched photographs.
You know, what I would say is, even if it's not possible to get a physical copy of your presentation, this webinar is being recorded and it will be shared on the Kerry Biosphere website along with all the other Try Biosphere series webinars. It'll also be on the Dublin Bay Biosphere YouTube channel, I should say, with the other Dublin Bay Biosphere webinars. So the information will be there for anyone to access at any point going into the future. So that's handy. Eleanor, do you have a question there?
Yes, so I have a question actually that's coming from Brishi, who I know is one of our colleagues working in the Isle of Man. And she's asked, are there any education projects happening in schools to enable the Biosphere residents to grow up understanding the difference between native and invasive species of wildflower and how to conserve and protect these important plants? And now Emer Needul, who's another attendee, has responded to this question and actually said that in Ireland we have what's called the Heritage in Schools scheme, that helps fund experts visiting schools and doing workshops like that. Now, because of COVID, it's been online for the last year, but hopefully it'll be coming back up and running. But I'd love if the speakers could share any information they have on potential opportunities for people to get an education in this, or how do you get started in learning to identify these wildflowers or wild plants that seem to be like quite complex for someone who's not used to it, and some of them definitely seem so small that it seems like you could just walk past them and never know they're there. So what advice would you give someone getting into that?
Can I just say, I mean, through the local agenda 21 Environment Protection Fund, so it's a fund that was available through local authorities. In Dunleary, when I was the environmental awareness officer, we engaged with a gentleman who was an expert on invasive species, and we linked him with a community group and a school so that they can work in partnership to understand the issues and work towards tackling those issues. So it's something that has happened, but I'm sure there's other options. So maybe our experts know of more.
Honest answer, I don't.
Okay.
Can I come in on that?
Of course you can, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, where I learned most of my plants was through Dublin Naturalist Field Club. Now, I know not everybody has a field club near you, but I would really encourage you to look and see if you have a field club near you, because it's by far and away the best place that you'll learn your plants. You won't, even if you go to college to do, to study botany or environmental science or whatever it is, you'll learn a small amount, but the place that you'll really learn them are in the field clubs, and especially for children as well. I mean, obviously, over the last year and a half, we haven't been able to run proper outings. We've had some online talks, but normally when the field club is up and running, there would be events aimed at children, and things like rock pools and stuff like that the kids just love. So children and adults, if you find the right field club, if you're fortunate enough to have one near you, it's really, really worth it. The BSBI is another option, but that's kind of probably for if you're a little bit more committed already. So yeah, I'd really just encourage you to have a look for a field club.
I mean, I mentioned earlier in my short presentation there about our Biosphere Award, and that's about engaging young people, getting them to understand what's around them and to take action to protect our biosphere. And I know, we want people to understand some of the challenges like the sea buckthorn, And I know we've scout groups that are very keen to get involved in helping tackle that particular issue on North Bell Island. So, you know, there are avenues that we're going as a Biosphere to try and, you know, engage with our community in that area. So yeah, fantastic stuff. We've another question there from Brishi again. Does the broom rape pose risk to other species as a parasite, or is this a mutual agreement? is it yeah, Tim?
I believe it's a mutual.
Yeah,
it's of benefit.
Mutual beneficial.
Mutual benefit. It doesn't kill the plant, and you know, if you take, for example, the ivy, there's considerable amounts of ivy all across the biosphere, let alone the country, and where it occurs, there's usually not large carpets of it.
Yeah.
You know, so there's different types of parasitism, and it's a fascinating subject in itself. You know, one which you could have another talk, even if you wanted to talk about ivy and it being a hemiparasite, but that's for another day.
Fantastic. So that was answered live. Fantastic. We mentioned about you know, supporting our pollinators and the like, and the dandelion, the Taraxacum officinalis, was mentioned as a real winner, something that we, you know, if we can leave, please do, because that'll provide really early energy for our bees, and actually late energy as well. I mean, the dandelion will flower for a very long period. Are there any other champion species that we should look after and protect and encourage rather than destroy? Anyone?
I think white clover is amazing as a species, yeah, and I often see it as just kind of on the edge of a lot of places, and yeah, and it's highly scented as well. It's such a great plant, and it's definitely at the moment it's just all over it. Yeah, it's a really good species at the moment. Yeah.
So when you're doing the Biosphere Challenge and you've got to spend an hour in nature, sitting amongst white clover that has a beautiful smell would be highly encouraged. I like that.
Sitting amongst it, but not picking it. I remember.
But not picking it.
Sorry, Richard, I see that you put a question in the chat there. Do you want to ask that one?
Yeah, and just I used to be a beekeeper as well, just related to the last question. And as a gardener, lungwort, you know, may not be native in the hedgerows here, but it was very good for early flowers. And of course, the other end of the year, the ivy is so important in having such huge amounts of nectar so late in the year, right into November. Really, really important. So you get that stretch of the season.
Yeah, I heard that the dandelion, brambles, and the ivy are three really, really key species for all our wildlife. Would that be fair?
Yes, you could put nettle in there as well, not necessarily as a pollinator, but as a source food for caterpillars and butterflies and things like that. So areas of dereliction, and they help the soil as well themselves.
Fantastic. Okay, so
I think the key thing as a gardener going wider than the wild plants here on the bee front is remember that they're after nectar and pollen. So a lot of these new wildflowers you get are not designed to produce seed essentially, but flowers. And so getting the kinds that do have the reproductive parts within there, and they're not just a mass of petals.
Yeah, fantastic.
But yeah,
sorry, just a quick question there. We mentioned about the wildflower mixes that are not wildflower mixes, they are just flower mixes. Where can we go if you're a resident group? Where can we go to guarantee that we're getting the right wildflowers? And should we be getting these wildflower mixes and sowing these wildflower mixes? Maybe that's a question for somebody.
It's quite difficult to get true native Irish wildflowers. Yeah, so that's an issue. I suppose at the moment you suggest to people, if it's a small enough area, you just kind of look around your area and maybe collect seed just locally. If it's, you know, not in a special area of conservation, or you don't need permits, or, you know, just some basic things that you could do like that. Yeah, again, you'd have to kind of just search around, but definitely a local source is always the best source, I think. Yeah, definitely as much as you can, but it's definitely a big gap, I think, because most people want to buy, like when they want to buy wildflowers, they're assuming they're buying Irish wildflowers.
Yeah.
So in instances they're
Yeah,
not. So it's quite hard to find the genuine.
Yeah.
The genuine.
So, I mean, the
But
seed bombs that you can get, avoid them. Pick your own local seeds at the end of the season, and so then, I mean, really, if to be successful, you want to remove the nutrients from the soil, from the area that you want the wildflowers to succeed. So maybe removing some of the soil.
Can I come in on that?
Melinda, yeah.
I would just suggest looking at it a slightly different way. I mean, pollinators depend, and invertebrates and species in general, there's a more sort of complex setup, I think. And I think that just going back to thinking about the habitat as opposed to kind of picking out individual species, that's really the key thing. If you think about a lot of pollinators, they need the pollen, they need the nectar, but they also need nesting sites. And, the larvae, as Tim pointed out, nettles are really important. You're not going to get nettles in your wildflower seed mixtures. So, it's a more complex kind of setup. So I would really just encourage you. I think the point that you made earlier about do nothing, that's really probably the best. It's not always do nothing. I mean, obviously it's very hard to give generic advice because it depends on the site. But I think managing for native habitats is the single most important thing you can do. So if it's a grassland habitat, don't mow it too often, but it probably needs some mowing, or else it's going to become a little bit overgrown.
And remove the cuttings and let nature do its thing, and you will get natural plants. Fantastic, really good advice. We are out of questions, I believe, unless I've missed something. I don't know.
There was a few just in the chat. Sorry, Richard, do you want to jump in there? Yeah.
I can ask about ladies' tresses. Melinda mentioned the autumn ladies' tresses, and they have grown here in the past in dune slacks, but they seem to have petered out, and we've tried a bit of grazing. Is there anything we can do to actually try and promote this plant in dune slacks?
Have you noticed any difference in the dune slacks other than the Spiranthes? Has anything else changed about the dune slacks that you can see?
Have details, I'm afraid.
I would say in Bull Island, the thing that I would be most concerned about, two things I would be concerned about. One is drying out of the dune slack, and the second, and they're related. As the dune slack dries out, there's a tendency for some of the coarser plants to move in, and because autumn ladies' tresses are such small plants, they're going to get shaded out very quickly. So if you get bigger plants, things like Succisa maybe, or Philipendula meadowsweet, those kinds of plants, they're much bigger, and they will just squeeze out some of the small plants. So I think if you're getting, if you see, I would just say, see if you can identify are there other changes, and if not, I think I would wait and just see if they come back. If you think everything is just the way it should be, I would wait and see if they come back, because a lot of orchids are they're so temperamental that they can be there one year and not there another year. So they might, and they're so small as well that they could be there and they could be missed. So I look for changes, and other than that, just wait and see.
Actually, Melinda, you did mention earlier about the bee orchid being on North Bull Island one year, not the next, and then 300 species the year after recorded. I mean, is this just due to winter climatic conditions, or is it something else? Are we guessing?
I think it's a whole lot of things put together. I mean, if you think one year that they might be very successful, so they might produce lots of seed, or they might be very unsuccessful, and a lot of the plants might die off. So whatever happens one year might feed into the next year, or if they can't flower one year, they might be sort of saving up all the what's built up below the ground, might be getting all saved up, so that in I think it was 2018 we couldn't find a single bee orchid, but it was kind of they had built up their reserves, and they really put on a wonderful show the next year. And then I think this year we had seen a lot of rosettes over the winter, so we were expecting to see lots of plants, but I think they got hammered by the frost.
Right.
So it can be the population is going to have an impact on what happens the next year, but it's also the conditions, weather conditions, and if it happens to be very cold or very dry, it'll impact it as well. So I think it's a very complex set of conditions, very hard to predict.
It was mentioned earlier that a lot of people are out and about and experiencing our biosphere, and enjoying this wonderful resource, particularly during lockdown. But obviously that can have a significant impact. So your advice to the general public, if they are out and about visiting these places, what would your advice be to them?
Well, I suppose that there are certain obvious things that are real problems. People bringing barbecues into the dunes is one that you just, it just causes so much damage if the dunes go on fire. So there's certain things like that where you really just have to use common sense. But other than that, I think it's, just be mindful of the surroundings. Try not to walk too much off the tracks, because if you don't know what's there, you don't know what you're going to be standing on. If you stick to the main pathways, it's fine. A lot of it is really common sense, and I certainly wouldn't want to stop people getting out to enjoy what there is to see.
Yeah, by all means, visit the bull, but stick to the pass and don't bring any barbecues. Sounds like great advice to me. And bring your litter home with you.
Exactly.
Absolutely, 100%. And that kind of goes without saying. And
And
any
then,
other tips?
keep your dog on a lead, as from the last webinar we had as well, Dee.
That's an interesting point, Eleanor, because I know with a lot of these species that we find in the wild areas, they rely on having low nutrients. So if a dog introduces additional nutrients, which it's going to do, can that have a significant impact as well, a negative impact?
I think that the biggest casualty is the birds' nests. I mean, it's not so much at this time of the year, but earlier in the year, ground nesting birds. A lot of people don't realise that many bird species nest on the ground.
Yeah.
So I mean, I've been told by people with dogs, that their dogs would never touch the nests up in the trees, but that's not where the problem lies. No.
Yeah.
The hares that used to be out on Bull Island, I mean, I think all the evidence points to the fact that dogs are responsible for the fact that there are no hares out on Bull Island any longer. So it's that kind of thing that the dogs cause problems with.
Yeah, and that was mentioned. The grazing has a real beneficial effect on rare species. So if there's no hares because there's dogs on the island, then that's an issue.
I think on the dogs front also, some people don't realise that even if their dog doesn't predate nests, that's not the whole story, because often it takes the nesting bird's attention away, and other birds can be watching and come down and predate the nest behind because the nest is no longer protected by the parents, and that can actually be a bigger issue.
Complicated, isn't it?
It's all connected. There's just another question that came in through the chat there as well while the talk was going on about some of the resources you've mentioned. So what ID guide would you recommend, and where would you recommend people going for information about these plants? I know, Tim, you mentioned a website, I think.
Oh, that was the wildflowersofireland.net, Zoe Devlin. And she started off, if you read her history, she in the Wexford Naturalist Club like that, and a fascinating plant. Her recent books have been reissued, extremely popular and very, very good quality information. Like, other than that, I don't recommend books to any botanist, because I started off at about 6. That's how I learned plants. And it's sitting down, going to field clubs, looking at the plants, trying to measure them, talk to people. If you go out with another botanist who knows the plants, you're going to ask them the question 5 or 6 times. What's this? It's daisy. What's this? It's daisy. It will seep in. And that's the genuine, honest how people do it. Don't feel silly. Enjoy the plants.
Yeah.
One of the other tricks that I often tell people is, if you're a gardener, think about what's in your garden, the family. So if you see a rose, you know what they have, serrated leaves. Think about that in wildlife and see, is there plants there? Like, you'd be surprised. Strawberries, some of the ground things, they're all related to the rose family. Yeah. And it helps you look. Using keys is very tricky. There's no 2 ways about it. When especially when they don't have pictures, the pictures can obscure things for you. So looking at these dichotomous keys and figuring out, it's not always easy. So it could be a range of keys. But as a website, there is information out there. Look it up, and then maybe look at a few sources, and then practice.
Practice makes perfect, as always.
I'm just going to share my screen, if you don't mind, because I want to get up a final slide, because we're about to go. We're about to sign off, and I just wanted to make sure that
such a fascinating day, actually, with so much information. It's been one I'll be watching back, I think.
A brilliant webinar, absolutely. So I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah, that's up.
Slide.
It's just small. Yeah, there you go.
Okay,
Both
fantastic.
sides.
There you go. So yeah, I mean, really important to recognize our speakers, Melinda, Nolene, and Tim. Thank you so much for your expertise. Really appreciate it. Thank you for our colleagues in the other biospheres for supporting these webinars and for your contributions. And thank you for the Dublin Bay Biosphere partners who funding these webinars, or certainly our webinars. They're listed there. And thank you also to Scott Corley, UCD and Trinity, where our experts are based. And I just wanted to share that with you. And thank you all so much for sharing your knowledge and giving us such fantastic information. And like I said, this webinar will be available for people to see for many years to come, and hopefully lots and lots of people will benefit from it. So thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.